Thanks so much, Sasha, and thank you all for being here. Just wanted to say a big thank you for Sasha for inviting me to share this first presentation with you. Um, it's really an honor, and I think it's very important, this initiative, to just open up the conversation about how we can actually help environmental psychology be more impactful in the real world. I think that's one of my motivations to be here. Um, and I think one way we can do that is actually try to be more critical in the way we actually take up our subjects, about the questions we ask, the methods we use, and so on. So thank you, Sasha, very much for having me here with you for this first session. So my section will be to broadly introduce a bit of my thinking on why we need to be a bit more critical in the context of environmental psychology today, which is basically we're not just having a climate crisis, but also we do have lots of other planetary changes in progress. All of you might be familiar with the Planetary Boundaries Report. The recent one which came out shows that we've reached quite a few ecosystem boundaries, for instance, biodiversity loss, but there are also others such as air pollution, nitrogen, soil fertility, and so on. So I think when we think about the word polycrisis, I think it encompasses climate change, but also these other environmental changes, which is interesting because that really relates to the beginning of trying to understand environmental psychology and how the environment affects human psychology and behavior as well. So some of the first efforts, I think, to think about the person in relation to the environment, Sashik, if you could put the timeline on, was in relation to environmental effects on behavior. So I think Lewin is quite a famous one. But really, Helpach, have I pronounced that right? The German pronunciation is right? Yeah. Helpach was the one who was attributed to coining this term environmental psychology. He tried to study the effects of random stimuli from colors, the sun and the moon, to the environment and the built environment itself, in order to understand how the world around us really affects our choices and behaviors and thoughts and beliefs. And really this sort of progressed to more architectural sort of initiatives to look at how architectural psychology and the built environment around us influences our behavior. But also from the 60s and the 70s onwards, especially, people were more and more concerned with the effects of pollution and the effect of environmental pollution on human behavior. So there was a growing interest, partly due to things like, revival of environmental movements in the West, but also in other parts of the world, on the effects of oil spills, poor water quality, and so on human behavior. And this sort of obviously influenced the development of environmental psychology as well. If we fast forward to the 90s, then we have the sort of growth of the UN Sustainability Framework, Sustainable Development Goals, debates around limits to growth, and so on. And coming to today, we sort of seem to be circling back to those debates when we really think about what is sustainable, what are the limits to growth, and what are the planetary boundaries and the system level changes that we need to comprehend. From the perspective of actually psychological science and behavioral science more broadly, there's been a large focus on the impact of consumer behavior, so individual level behavior change from the 80s, 90s, and 2000s onwards. And I think currently one of the more encompassing approaches, which brings together not just environmental psychology, but also insights from places like behavioral economics, which is a bit more my positioning in this field, is really behavioral science and the sort of growth in green nudges, where the idea is that we should use these insights from psychology, which have evolved over these past decades, to really inform not just our understanding of behavior, but also the design of policy interventions to change behavior itself. So I think the archetypal sort of example of this came out with this book, Nudge, where there were examples of, for instance, changing the default in order to help people choose better. So, for instance, the archetypal example here is smaller plate sizes makes us take fewer portions. So in the environmental space, the argument would be default to more veg dishes or purely veg or plant-based dishes to reduce meat consumption. So really, my field, I come from an interdisciplinary background where I've studied development, economics, and now psychology and public policy. And really the starting point here was that people know best. So trust people to choose best. And this sort of came through with this idea that people are quite rational, this Homo economicus model, which drove a lot of policy debate. The idea that people, and indeed firms in some cases, reveal their preferences to choices, and these choices were made on the assumption that we had unbounded rationality, which meant we were unlimited selfish, we only thought of ourselves, more is always better. We also had unlimited willpower and foresight. So the main intuition behind this is we know these models and these assumptions are wrong, but they can be useful insofar as they're predictive. And with the behavioral economics revolution, which was largely due to insights from psychology, but also feels like political science, the idea was that people are actually have bounded rationality, they can be altruistic, they do have limited willpower, and they lack foresight. So studying these sort of imperfect people was possible through psychological insights, including those from environmental psychology. But pretty much this body of findings try to suggest that very simple tweaks in our social and physical context, but also in the ways that we present information, for instance, through framing or priming, can get us quite substantial results in the real world. And those substantial results were not just in changes of awareness and attitudes, but also actually behavior. So if you change the default, that doesn't mean you're just more willing to choose renewable energy, but you're also actually choosing renewable energy, really. But of course, institutional structure and all these changes are quite hard. So the second wave, which has been increasingly coming out from the 2000s, there's actually these big intention behavior gaps. So even if people don't really have, even if people have the intention to change their behavior, they might not actually do it in the real world. And this is where the sort of power of nudges and green nudges sort of captured this public imagination, especially in the policy space. Because the idea was that actually we can shortcut this intention behavior gap by designing the context right. So if you basically preset the default, then we actually get a larger number of people to choose the suggested default because we exploit their inattention. We think about the default as giving them a suggestion, for instance, as to the better option. So really, this really was very powerful when behavior change is quite hard in the real world. So a lot of people started to advocate for these psychologically infused interventions, sort of like these nudge type interventions, which would be very helpful for changing environmental behavior to address these issues like climate change. Keep in mind that a lot of the insights around biases, heuristics, and decision-making really came from the health space, for instance, and financial decision-making, where they were framed as internalities. So if you help address these sort of biases in decision making, people will be better to choose options that are best for themselves. But of course, as we know, environmental change, climate change, planetary change is sort of a global action problem, right? Our choices don't just determine the outcome. Everyone's choices collectively determine these outcomes. So really, when we look at the growing evidence for nudges, but especially around green nudges, we find actually they can be somewhat limited in their effectiveness. This doesn't mean they don't work, but when they work and for which domains they work and to how long they work have really been up for debate. And I think two broad spaces really summarize this. There was a recent meta-analysis which came out in 2019, Nisa et al., which showed actually the effect size for a lot of nudge interventions was very small. Subsequent expansions of this work, which especially look at environmental nudges, also show those nudge effects can be really small. One of the more successful nudges in this context are things like defaults, especially for things like energy. But for many others, especially when it came to informational effects, which were often proven through controlled experiments in the lab as well as the field, using often student samples, but more recently large online samples even, have not found to replicate very well. And there's a huge variation in these effect sizes. There's also the file drawer problem, where larger effect sizes or more counterintuitive effect sizes were tending to be published more. Another broad change, which we found in the literature, the more and more results start to accumulate with more experimental, largely evidence, was there was no clear evidence of spillover effects. So, for instance, one very popular theory was the idea of moral licensing. So the idea that if I do something personally expensive but good in the short run, so I eat a veg meal, although I'm non-vegetarian for the climate, I might license myself to do something a bit naughty later, the idea of moral licensing. Again, we found actually there were no clear spillover effects. The Marquis et al. Study, for instance, which came out in Nature Sustainability, I think in 2019, sort of aggregated the evidence for pro-environmental behavior spillovers. And they found while spillovers were quite possible, especially when you had too attitudinal or intention-based measures, which relied on self-reports, when it actually came to real behavior, it was quite difficult for studies to document this big significant spillover effect. Other evidence from fields such as behavioral economics, for instance, have noted that although you might have effects of interventions in the short run, when you actually take them out into the wild, into the field, there's a drop in the effect size. So the voltage, essentially, of these interventions are set to drop. So really, there is this question that is facing us all in the field at the moment, which is how are we studying how are we studying the effects of these interventions to really change behavior in the real world? And what is the overall impact of our interventions that we're suggesting that we spend a lot of time refining and finessing in the lab actually on this socio-ecological transformation? And I think this paper by Nielsen and colleagues really sort of tries to highlight that a bit. And really, is the potential of behavioral science restricted to informing how information is presented and environments designed, but should it also be extended to a more complex set of interventions that are actually in use in the real world? The design of laws, mandates, policies, incentives like carbon taxes, and so on. So really, there's a lot of interesting scope here, which really reflects sort of this larger credibility crisis or revolution in psychology, but also science. This recent paper, which was in PNAS this year by Yu and colleagues, tried to look at replication within the field of psychology by subfield. They found that there was some sort of a negative correlation between the percentage of experimental research in the subfield and the replication score. They used the machine learning models, and they found that fields like social psychology, which had a large section of experimental research, tended to have sort of lower replication scores. This was sort of interesting because especially if you look at environment psychology as a sort of extension of social psychology, there's a lot of noise in each environment that we study. And if we're basing a lot of results on particular sorts of methods and ways of inquiry that might not replicate very well, it raises the question, are we using the right tools? Are we approaching the questions with the right mindset? And this is really within a larger sort of debate amongst the trustability of scientific findings. In fields like cell biology, apparently replication rates are also really low. So this has huge implications for both the validity of the claims we're making within the field, but also the impact our scientific findings can have on the real world. Are they taken seriously? Are they seen as credible by people, especially if there's so much churning within the fields themselves? And indeed, people have argued that this is not just a crisis, but really it's a revolution in how we do science. So I think the most clear evidence of this is in the open science revolution, where the idea of open science would really argue, especially for fields of confirmatory, hypothesis testing and analysis, we should be able to pre-register the data and make all the data fully available and replicable and reproducible so that other researchers can check and validate the findings. This paper by Korbmacher, apologize for my pronunciation at all, which came out recently, sort of did a nice synthesis on the multi-level initiatives within universities and within the scientific space more broadly that looked at both individual and community level changes. So things like open science practices, which are often voluntarily taken up by individual researchers, more fields of more methods of study like meta-analysis, which really try to aggregate experimental results, but also more structural changes, such as having replication as being part of the curriculum. This is what I taught in my master's program at LSE. We have a huge emphasis on methods, for instance, and the students are asked to either replicate existing studies or actually pre-register as a part of their training if they're taking primary data analysis and collection. Some journals now also require this as a part of a more sort of systematic change in the field. However, I find that a lot of these debates are restricted to methods. What's a good method of doing science? Because science sometimes, the scientific method is often the preoccupation. But however, there are lots of challenges. For instance, in environmental and psychology, in social psychology, should we expect studies to replicate more broadly, especially if the social setting is very important in determining the outcomes, where very small tweaks in information or setting or incentives or populations really matter? And we do see from the replication crisis and this overall credibility revolution that a lot of received information we have are wrong. So a huge domain which is coming up, like cross-cultural psychology, for instance, really tries to systematically analyze how different social cultural backgrounds and settings and belief structures influence findings. From the environmental psychology space, from the perspective of trying to address planetary change and contribute positively to it, I guess we have an obligation to not just restrict, in my view, our evaluation of method or knowledge to have, you know, a critique of the methods. So things like correlation is not causation, or preoccupations with generalizability or internal validity. That is important. It's very important. But I think we also have to ask ourselves more broadly why we look for generalizability when the context we know really matters. Why is it that we privilege particular methods of inquiry, for instance, experimental methods, which I largely rely on, over others, say more qualitative methods, which might be richer, but really are not able to generalize in these same ways? And really how our methods and approaches and our ways of doing science really serve the real world problems that we face. Really what I think we need to do at this point, especially when you have a very urgent issue like climate change, is really ask how is our academic knowledge actually used in the real world? And how does real world politics really inform why we're choosing to do science the way we do? And with that, I think that's why critical perspective is important, and I'll hand over to Sasha.
Thank you very much, Ganga. So as your narration also about the history and the current state of environmental psychology kind of shows, is to me and other critical perspectives that science is always embedded in culture, in history, and this is often overlooked. And the play that our own discipline has in reproducing certain ways of being and certain ways of power. So in this series and opening with this talk, we argue that it's important to look at how psychology and environmental psychology is part of the problem itself, and the critique is directed towards the theories, methods, and practices of psychology as a discipline, and with it also certain narratives. So the narrative of individual behavior change that is in a way often quite paternalistic and individualizing, where we come back to in a second. So the aim is to construct psychological knowledge as it is and reflect on its role in supporting, maintaining, and ignoring historical and existing social power relations, leading to inequalities and injustice that have led to the climate crisis in the first place. So we and other authors argue that psychological science is individualizing, especially environmental psychology, is putting the responsibility on the individual to change their behavior, to just start to recycle, to save energy, to purchase green products in a way that is still hinges on the idea of a green growth narrative. So it encourages the individual to strive for positive affect, even though the material conditions might not be there to do so. It fosters narratives of the personal growth in a way distracts from necessary sociological and cultural change and the larger responsibility our society has. Furthermore, psychological science is often deteriorizing and ahistoricizing. What this means is that it takes certain findings, particularly on Western rich democratic countries, as universal and portrays them as the gold standard, also to design policies and to act. Even though much research has shown that a lot of our behavior is culturally embedded and strongly influenced. And therefore, the universal orientation kind of reproduces these power structures of coloniality, where the Eurocentristic and Western knowledge creation is kind of distributed around the globe. It excludes certain views, perspectives, and neutralizes the capacities to confront the forces, and especially the social justices that motivated it in the first place. So psychological science is thereby legitimizing and reproducing hegemonic forms of colonial and neoliberal power. You could even maybe add patriarchal power. So it claims to be unbiased and objective, and it constructs this neutrality in terms that are rooted in bias towards wide Western worldviews. It claims to be unpolitical, while it is quite political. It is taking a stance by not taking a stance. So in a form, it's an intellectual imperialism, that the neutrality is just maintained through the status quo and forces assimilation to a Western industrialized, rich democratic epistemic standpoint. And what is overseen is that political neutrality is an oxymoron, which can be tracked historically to psychological tendencies to become more of a natural science and to acquire experimental and positivistic approach to research. So often these ontological and epistemological questions within psychological science are often not reflected upon, and that's what a critical perspective needs and does take into the discussion. So environmental psychology in itself set out with a political stance against the injustice and against the extraction and destruction of life on Earth, and therefore should also take a stance against ideology, the neoliberal ideology that is hinged on growth and brought the crisis on us in a way in the first place. So in a way, the mainstream is trying to find a new theory of change in this narrative. And there are within the discipline growing voices that are becoming more critical, but also from outside. So those call for inclusion of more critical theory. The focus is put less on the individual, but rather on the collective. So there are more and more research and studies appearing on collective action. Here again, we see the embeddedness of the science, a reaction to rising activism, especially around the climate crisis. Critical perspectives highlight that we need to empower participants. So there's always a hierarchy between researchers and participants, and their approaches to include participants more in the research process. So we would encourage research that directly profits marginalized groups. Further, I would like to now introduce you to more of a holistic perspective on our current modernity. So it's a scheme that is developed actually outside from psychology by educational researchers that use this for climate education and to showcase the embeddedness and the intertwinedness of our current system, and which is called the House of Modernity. So the House of Modernity is the space that most of us in low intensity struggles, so in rich, educated countries live in. And our house is built on a foundation of separation. So the idea is that we are separate as humans from the non-human nature, and it refuses from a colonial perspective the relationship and responsibilities that we have to each other, but particularly the well-being also of the whole social ecological metabolism. And it racializes and genders hierarchies of existence through this separability. The walls of the House of Modernity are built by global, the roof is global capitalism and the idea of unending economic growth and wealth accumulation. It's exploiting humans and other than human beings. The walls are built by nation states, the security and order through property, the social cohesion through national identity. So it sanctions the state violence, it's policing, it's leading to global militarism. Just over the weekend, a new conflict arose on the globe between Israel and Palestine that potentially is also referring to this point, was what we see. And we have a wall of universal knowledge. So the modern promise is that through certainty, predictability, and meaning, we find a single path forward through knowledge. And in that way, we denigrate other knowledge forms and systems outside of the Western world that rationalizes, in a way, authority and control. And within the House of Modernity, there is a staircase of social hierarchies. So the status in socioeconomic mobility is promised to be rewarded through hard work. But within also is coloniality that ascribes different and conditional value to what lives in the work of humans and other than human, non-human beings. So Antonetti, Stein, and colleagues developed these graphical depictions that I can highly raise your awareness to use them also as an educational means to showcase the connectedness between the coloniality of modernity and the climate crisis. Here on these pictures, you again see what I just presented to you on the table. So there are hidden costs within the house. The floor has hierarchies, but what mostly we all now see are structural damages, and these connections to the problems of the house need to be drawn in order to respond in a just way to the climate crisis. The authors explore further reasonings that I won't go into depth now, because I think there are several possibilities and explanations, but they all hinge on certain fears, desires, and entitlements that come with the House of Modernity and our way of being, and that those will be more explored in depth in the following sessions that we will have next month and the months after. So we hope to see you there again to dig deeper into these exploring the House of Modernity. So right now, there is no such thing as critical environmental psychology. There are some publications that could be linked to a critical social environmental psychology. They, as we do in this talk, address the frustration within mainstream. There's a greater emphasis on a decolonial perspective and a holistic view of the Foley crisis. We hope to be able to add something to this discourse with this lecture series. Also, we plan to host a book. We have a book that will come out next year from our working group. So keep posted. And I forgot this slide. I also already made commercials for a book. So this is based on further addressing how we could become more a critical environmental psychology. And Ganga and me and others are currently exploring how psychologists could become more critical in their work. And one approach that has been put forward is by the theory from the South that suggests that researchers should indigenize, which means deflect the imposition of hegemonic, typical Western, industrialized, rich democratic countries, knowledge traditions, and therefore educate oneself about multiple knowledge traditions without epistemic extractivism and appropriation. We also see this that now more and more research is being done in weird countries, but in an extractivistic way, which is quite critical. So there would be an approach to be more inclusive and more cooperative instead of extractivist, and try to learn first. This also means to denaturalize, to critically reflect or taking for granted assumptions about human being, and especially the divide of human being with the non-human natural world, and which is often disregarding socioeconomic, cultural, and historical contexts. And we are highlighting accompanying to form solidarity research partnerships with researchers, but also participants to identify and critique oppressive structures within academia, but also outside. Here I would come to an end. I also thank you for your attention, and I would now open the floor for questions and further discussion. Thank you very much.
I was thinking the House of Modernity has a really good overlap with the choice architecture sort of terminology. There's a bit of a debate on should the economist act as a plumber with humility to do little tweaks in the system. That was Esther Duflo's position. And then really then there was no, actually, I think Taylor's response to that was actually, no, we need a choice architect, someone who can design the house well. But I actually, in my lectures, in my course, I often end with, but if the whole house is crumbling, and I think the House of Modernity really fits that. So what do you do from a disciplinary standpoint when the structures are broken or the structures are breaking? So yeah, I think thanks for that slide. I think it's very useful.
The office of the House of Modernity, what they say is to find ways to hospice modernity, so that we do not try to hinge on modernity, but that we find a gentle way and humane way to hospice, because there's at current stage no way of saving modernity. What comes after that is unpredictable, as future is always, but we should strive for justice and humanity, or more than your humanity.
I think, Sasha, why don't you take Megan's question? Could the speakers talk a bit about how these ideas have shaped your own research?
Well, to be honest, I have politicized myself a bit too late. So I just finished my PhD, and my PhD was also quite in line with mainstream research on pro-environmental behavior change. And throughout the years, I became more and more aware about the problematics that come with it, not just only their lack of impact and lack of spillover on larger lifestyle changes, but also their paternalistic way, also coloniality that is inherent in the research. And currently I'm trying to re-steer and educating myself on critical perspectives and coming in with new approaches, new ideas, but that will take time. Yeah.
So in my experience, I mean, I myself am Tamil. So I came to the UK actually to do my master's and the PhD. So, you know, I learned a whole technocratic language by doing a PhD in environmental economics. So my training is as an economist really, and I got more interested in behavior, but I've really come from quite an interdisciplinary background. So I did development studies and I looked at more qualitative research in my first master's, for instance. So I think I forgot a lot of the knowledge or deprioritized it in order to adapt to my new knowledge system. And so I think for me, it's a process of remembering and remembering, and also sort of circling back a bit to my original training and roots. So that's one thing I'll say. That doesn't mean that that doesn't come with its own issues, right? So I think when we're being critical, you have to be critical of everything. There's no one, you know, that's the point, is you should be able to reconcile differences and contradictions. So I think that for me is a process I'm starting now. In terms of examples of how we're shaping this, I'll give you examples of what I'm doing and then some other colleagues are doing as well at LSE. So I think I'm moving away from restricting myself to just confirmatory hypothesis testing with experimental research. So I'm interested nowadays in sort of more grounded up theory methods and really going from the field up. And I'm also diversifying my field sites. So currently I have projects. I'm fortunate enough to have a project not just in the UK, but also in the Middle East. I have some behavioral water security projects in some sub-Saharan countries, and I'm going back to my own home as a field site, as a researcher from the field site, for myself. So I'm working on mangrove restoration in Tamil Nadu. I'm starting to do that now. So I think I'm diversifying my field site, but also my project partners. So I am working in interdisciplinary teams with people with multiple expertise in different methods. So not just quantitative methods, but also qualitative methods. I'm also trying to do more multi-level research, so with individuals, but also communities and organizations. And lastly, I think that sort of brings us to the collaborations aspect, not just in academia, but really working with organizations outside academia. But this has always been a strength of behavioral science in terms of it's an application-oriented field and it's a policy-oriented field. So, but for instance, I'm not just thinking of policymakers, but also companies, but also social movements. So I'm trying to work with a diverse array of players. This does mean that I'm overworked, but that's kind of the choice you have to make, I think, is, you know, you slow down and pick a bunch of projects that you like and focus on a few things. You can't do everything. So I think I'm personally in that stage. I know some other colleagues have tried to do an audit of the curriculum at the Psychological Behavioral Sciences in my department. It's led by my colleague Miriam Trash and some others, where they really did an audit of the types of readings and the sorts of viewpoints that were offered on different psychology courses. And I think they're at a stage of trying to bring in different voices which have been marginalized in an academic setting into the reading lists and things like this. But I think one thing they're struggling with is to make this a tick box exercise. So have you showed replicability in this sample, but in that sample and that sample? So you just have diverse samples, which are all online samples. I think that tends to be enough a lot of the time, but I think they're trying to push back against that as this just being a tick box exercise, which people can put into a research paper, or it can be something as an EDI initiative. It has to be a change in the mindset or way of doing science. I think that's the larger challenge. I'm just going to answer this one question from Jasha because it's a short answer. I don't know MMT, but I'm now going to go learn and find out. So thanks for putting that in the chat.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. Can you hear me? Just to
Yes.
confirm. Hello, everyone. Hi, Sasha. Hi, Ganga. Hi, everyone. Thank you for an educational introduction to a perspective which sort of highlighted a trajectory of the field. And a question I had more so was, it's less so a question, but more so an attempt to have a discussion on that. I think one of the things I think particularly Ganga, you highlighted was that typically and stereotypically in a lot of departments of empirical social sciences, there's a lot of focus on the replicability and sort of the rigor in empiricism. And while on one hand, the lack of replicability is one of the symptoms of the problem, and I was thinking more so from the perspective of environmental degradation, from the perspective of a system which is inherently racist. And thinking from that perspective, I was hoping if you could share some of the other issues you think have stemmed from extremely focusing on our current assumptions about the field, apart from the replication prices. Thanks.
Sure, I think that's a good question. So maybe two which annoy me. One is the focus on measurement means, it's a double-edged sword. If you don't measure, you can't evaluate and you don't understand what works. So I think we need to be able to measure and quantify, and we need to have conversations about generalizability. So I especially because I moved from a qual background because I got frustrated with the lack of the capacity to scale an intervention or choose what was the best option. So that's why I moved to quant. So I totally think it's important to be able to measure and do all of this. But on the flip side, not everything can be measured. And if there's a preoccupation with only what can be measured and what can be quantified, that means your attention is going to go towards what's easy to measure. And that means they could be things which are not important, right? And so I think, this is partly why I think there's a focus on measuring, how many times I recycled, right? When we're really thinking about, is recycling the optimum system at a structural level? That's a different question. And I think that's, so I don't think we can avoid measurement. And I think we need to think about when measurement is useful or how it can be useful. But I think an emphasis on just that will distract us from the larger questions, which actually are more meaningful and important at this stage, maybe, right? Like from the perspective at the stage we're talking at, which is actually what should our scientific method also incorporate. So one is that I think the excessive empirical quantification in terms of rigorous, I think that's one issue. The second thing is, I think, so that I've already spoken about replicability and generalizability, but I think the other thing which is important is actually we have many theories. When I came into psychology first, I got so confused. I wanted to understand a concept, and there were so many concepts for very allied concepts. So, especially from an economics background where you have got one central model and you looked at deviations from the model, came to sight there were so many theories. So it was very difficult to wrap my head around why the locus of control was different from a fatalism score, why, like, so what was the unique part of one trait or one theory or one attitude. So I think it's a very complex issue. So I think in a sense, if you open that up to different cultures and mindsets, there's going to be even more complexity. So I think there has to be a way to navigate that complexity, I think, a bit more simply. And I don't really know how to do that. But I think chasing, again, this is another double-edged sword, chasing theory building to set up a new theory at the cost of empirics versus the proliferation of very similar theories. I think there is like a thing there. So what I've just highlighted is a couple of like trends where I'm confused about, where I'd like to do more thinking. It's not a clear answer as to what one should do with that.
Yeah, if I may add, I ever wonder whether we can overcome this critique and debate within methodologies, right? Why is it always that we discuss so much about methods, but we hardly talk about the underlying epistemologies and ontologies? And I find this really frustrating in psychology, that this is rarely done, and it's super problematic how this positivistic view reproduces power imbalances. We spoke about racism, but these connections, I think they are really hard to grasp and understand, even for us researchers. And I think that's where we have to come in and translate. I think within like the critical theory, a lot of these narratives and ideas are well discussed and known in the mainstream or applied psychologies, where you come to the frustrations. These critical thoughts or narratives, understandings are quite hidden and not as easily accessible. So I think would encourage all of you to try to educate oneself, but educate others as well. And maybe this helps us to change the field in a way, so that critical environmental psychology becomes not a new field, but kind of revolutionizes current environmental psychology that has started out as a critical discipline in itself. I mean, Omar, we spoke about this. Maybe you also have something to add, or want to add something before I give Denise the chance to raise a question.
Thank you for, I appreciate you both sharing your thoughts. It's very valuable. And I find it always interesting, whenever we're talking about these things, we have to sort of appeal to our willingness to engage in scientific dialogue and the discipline in itself. You know, the notion that we're not totally against this, that in itself is like an epistemologically, ideologically something which appeals to how the notion of science building as an epistemology in itself, which carries power, is something we always give credence to. And I just think, apart from, I think, in my opinion, there is from a decolonial perspective, while you highlighted the the coloniality of epistemology, like how knowledge is being built, there's also the notion of coloniality of being. What makes a human versus a human, which goes into, I think it's relevant for our discipline, is thinking about what is nature, what is natural and non-natural. Why do we see these green spaces as separate from the social? While there is research and something which Trevor Lees, who's in attendance, is writing for his comp exams and is published for some of his MA work, talks about how there's a cult of wilderness. Even these green spaces function a colonial role as far as thinking about from a historical perspective. And I think if only cross-disciplinary people were to move away from these silos of behavioral sciences and actually read some other critical stuff, I think it'll be beneficial for us.
Thank you very much, Omar. Denise.
Hello, could you hear me?
Yes, you can.
Hello. I would like to ask a question. it's a very interesting point for me because, to be honest, I have zero psychological knowledge, but in this presentation, it's really enriched the knowledge. Thank you so much for it. I didn't feel foreigner. Why? The most of terminology I see that is in the social science circle is from the political science also. So, for example, this rational choice theory, also in the political science, the alternative is Herbert Simon's cognitive approach. It could be an enrichment. And when Sasha, you say for the epistemology, ontology, and methodology, and also for the reproduction of the hierarchy, I feel very similar to the Williams approach, to the one of the main founder of the cultural studies, and also from the Netherlands and also in UK, the Essex semiotic schools, and from the Netherlands, I think Van Dijk, the critical discourse analysis, semiotics. I think these disciplines can enrich the scientific knowledge production process for the ecological and critical psychology approach, because I have a little bit background about them and I feel very comfortable in this conversation. I didn't feel as a foreigner. Yeah, I would like to say, is there any interest in your side for this discourse analysis or to use some kind of this political science terminology and approach? Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Dennis. Yeah, I think there are a lot of bridges that can be built to other social sciences, right? And often research, and also when it comes to environmental psychology and other applied subdisciplines, they're quite built in ivory towers. And I think therefore it's important to build these bridges between disciplines, and I think the critical perspectives is a great way to do so, because they're often quite diverse and have their roots within different social sciences and are also be found in different social sciences. I, for example, attended the welcoming of the bachelor students today at our university, and it's quite shocking to see how there's such a strong dominance of these mainstream narratives in between the lines of the introduction of the subfields of psychology that put the focus so much on the individual and that work so well with the ideology of neoliberalism. And these new highly funded projects, at least at our university, they're all quite, to me, super utopian. They have such high hopes and continue these promises and desires of that science will, in a way, save us through some new neuropsychological finding, neurocognition research on VR that is being done quite utopian. And so, to me, super not hooked in reality, and to the suffering that is happening around the world, and quite a Eurocentristic Western view of what is necessity in the world. And so I'm coming back to your comment. I think it's really important to build bridges. It's quite challenging, and I wonder, throughout engaging more and more with critical psychological theory and thinking, what obstacles are put forward. It's probably quite challenging to acquire funding for critical perspectives. They're not often as sexy, maybe. So it's also a task to make critical perspective sexy and appealing to people, and also to funders. And there have been other critical works that have engaged in too much confrontational discourse as well. And I think it's quite crucial also to critique the structures, the notions, the ideas, but to avoid critiquing people personally, which is often a challenge in academia because we cite each other with our names, right? So it's always quite strongly hooked to our own identity, what we identify with. So yeah, it will be a challenge, and I think also for research to be really not in the ivory tower also means to look at how we engage other than just our normal type of research with society, like being part of maybe some political activism, being part of advisory work to NGOs, and there is yes, so many tasks to fulfill, also teaching, educating. And Ganga mentioned that it's really a challenge to find the right balance there. So yeah, thank you for taking this extra time all today. I think we've now reached the end of our session. We also see no other hands raised. If you have any further concerns, questions, feel free to contact us or the working group. Thank you for putting in this additional effort and time to be with us and to learn with us. And I'm looking forward to see you again next month. And yeah, thank you a lot, Ganga. Maybe you have some further words. Yeah, before Omar and Trevor, maybe you want to stick around. I would like also to shortly introduce you to Ganga because we have a project together. Yeah, but thank you everyone, and some last words to you, Ganga.
Thank you, Sasha, and thank you everyone for coming and the working group for putting this together. I think it's an amazing initiative, and I'm really excited to have more conversations like this. So thanks for your patience in listening to us, and thanks for actually coming and doing all this.